You get stopped, everybody, so I think it's time to start our webinar. So a warm welcome to everybody again this evening. I want to welcome, as always, Ian and Eilish, who are our great technical support to keep the program kind of steady and stable. And I want to welcome, of course, Jessie, who's going to talk to us about the prophets this evening. I can't welcome Sean because he's celebrating the Nativity of John the Baptist, which always occurs during the Scripture Summer School, as well as his own birthday today.
Thank you for all of you who've been emailing me questions and comments. What I've really enjoyed is reading some of your reflections and learning an awful lot about prophets, modern day prophets that I'd never heard about. So my list of people to explore and discover more about is getting longer and longer. So thank you very much for all of those questions. Now, I am trying to answer each question by email. You'll see I'm not quite up to date. I think if you emailed me this afternoon, I've probably read it, but I haven't actually got around to answering it yet. It's a challenge to know quite which questions to answer, but I thought, let me begin by just saying a bit about the Hebrew prophets, because there was so many things I wanted to get through and so many kind of ideas and images and concepts I wanted to introduce you to, that I probably neglected at the beginning to really say who these Hebrew prophets are. So when I say Hebrew prophets, what I'm looking at is the prophets that we find in the Hebrew Bible, in the Christian Old Testament. Now, we find some of these prophets in the stories, for instance, in the books of Samuel and Kings. But the prophets that I specifically was focusing on, or am focusing on, are the prophets who we call the writing prophets, the prophets who left us books of their prophecies, of their words, of their poetry. And in the Hebrew Bible, there's three big ones: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And then we have what is often called the Book of the 12. It's 12 little short books, not unimportant, but short, starting with Hosea. So Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, etc., etc. I remember as a kid being a nerd and being very proud that I was able to rattle them all off. I get stuck now a bit in my old age. So those are the Hebrew prophets. Now, Hebrew prophets are, as I've said, and I think this is very important, this tradition is shared equally by Jewish and Christian traditions. And in fact, I find some of the really, really powerful work that I've read on the Hebrew prophets has been written by Jewish philosophers and theologians. Some of you may have heard of Abraham Heschel. He's got a book, The Prophets, an absolute classic. There's a book I've actually just arrived. I've only started reading it, written by Nahum Ward-Lev, The Liberating Path of the Hebrew Prophets. So I suppose that's one thing I enjoy about the Hebrew prophets, is that this really is, as I say, a tradition that's shared in Judaism and in Christianity. I've had a few questions about women prophets. Are there women prophets? Well, of course there are women prophets. I mean, you know, who knows how to listen, if not women sometimes. So we do have women prophets, not as many as I'd like, but let me just give you a few. So this is in the stories in the Old Testament. Miriam in Exodus chapter 15, Miriam, who is Moses' sister, she's described as a prophet. So is a prophet Huldah, and we read about Huldah in the second book of Kings in chapter 22. And I do find it interesting that when the king needs to consult a prophet, even though we know that Jeremiah was a prophet during the time of the king Josiah, he actually had the good sense to send his people to a woman, to Hilda. So she's another woman prophet. Anna, you might remember Anna in the story of the presentation in the temple. She's described as a prophet. Now, we don't know this, but there are scholars who suggest that the voice of the anonymous prophet that we have in the second part of the book of Isaiah could, at least one of the voices there could be a female voice. And why would they say that? Well, when you look at the imagery that's used, particularly around childbirth and around midwifery, what some scholars have pointed out is this is definitely not written from the perspective of a man. It's not a kind of a male thinking about what that would be like, but they really do see. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I certainly like that. So that's the idea of women prophets. I have a list in front of me here of various questions that I want to come to, but I'd also like you not to feel that kind of I've got my agenda and you're just listening. So do feel free to put in questions into the Q&A that you'll find near the bottom of your screen there, because I can maybe even decide from the questions that come there which piece to go to first of all. Well, let me maybe go on to the question that I asked you, and then some of you asked me back, and some of you provided me with wonderful answers. Who are people today that we could consider to be modern day prophets? There's a lot of different possibilities. I really do believe that that Pope Francis is an example of a prophet, but there's another prophet that a few of you've mentioned to me, and I certainly do think she would count as a prophet anyway, according to Walter Brueggemann's definition, and that is the climate crisis campaigner, Greta Thunberg. Now, I just bring up her name just because it's kind of interesting to explore. She wouldn't, to my knowledge, she doesn't speak from an explicitly religious perspective. She doesn't claim to be speaking in the name of the Lord. And yet, what she is doing is she's really shining a light onto what's happening today. She has that insight, that idea of really forth-telling, and particularly telling us what, as a world, we've been very good at downplaying or ignoring. So I do think she's a good example of a prophet. One of the other ways, actually, that she is similar to the biblical prophets is she is a master at communication. She knows how to choose the right words. I mean, who would very easily forget her "How dare you" speech that she gave to the United Nations, and her just the symbolic actions like her taking the yacht when she went to the US. So she would be, in my opinion, somebody I would consider to be a modern day prophet. I'm looking now at some of the questions that have come through. One of the questions is, which prophet would you recommend as a starting point? If you feel like you're quite a novice to the Hebrew Bible, maybe actually begin with the book of Jonah, which is a story about a prophet. But you'll see there about, you'll see interesting themes explored. And then the second part of the book of Isaiah, from Isaiah 40, you'll find if you read there, you'll get don't get stuck on what doesn't resonate with you. But I'd say if you start, just read from Isaiah chapter 40. That might be a good place to start. Denise suggests that we might have prophets in our own family and friends. Absolutely. maybe I can take that to be asking this idea about prophetic calling. Can ordinary people be prophets? Yes, ordinary people can certainly be prophets. And as a community, I think the people of God were called to be prophets. So we really should be a community who lives out of an alternative vision, who lives out of the vision of the kingdom of God. And to the extent that we're doing that we're bearing witness to the kingdom, I think we can be a prophetic community. I think, though, that we also really need some people who are particularly gifted by God to call us back to our task and to call us back to covenant faithfulness. And if I can use sort of New Testament terminology, to call us back to living according to kingdom principles. And there are people who do that in very quiet ways. There are people who do that within our families. But I think there also is periodically, there are people that God calls kind of on a larger stage to speak to people. Yes, somebody else has suggested, is Peter McVerry a modern day prophet? Absolutely, I would say so, very, very definitely. And it's partly what he does, but prophets aren't just social activists. The thing about prophets is prophets work to change our way of seeing the world. And I think that one thing that Father Peter McVerry has done very, very effectively is to help us ourselves to see how we overlook people. And so I think he's definitely challenged our view of the world, as well as being a social activist himself. There was something else I wanted to say about, about the idea of the communal and the idea of community. I think some of the prophetic movements that we're seeing today, and thank you for a couple of you for pointing this out to me, are things like the protest movements that we've seen that began in the US and that have gone elsewhere. You can see that as something very prophetic happening, but I'd also say it's probably important for movements like that to be informed by the prophets, because what can so easily happen is movements, communities, we can lose our way, and prophets are the ones that help us to stay focused.
Jessie.
Yes.
Does your background in South Africa give you a special sympathy for prophets, do you think?
No, that's an interesting question. I think so. But partly what it does is it gives me insight into, can I say this, how easy it is to overlook prophets. Because when I was growing up in South Africa, I was growing up in a Christian community that was, I guess you could say, quite pietistic. I had parents who really taught me not to be racist, who taught me that racism was a sin. My mom was Irish, but I was also believed that Christians didn't get involved in politics. And so if you'd asked me as a teenager, I would have known nothing about him, but to my shame, I would have said that somebody like Desmond Tutu was a bad guy. And I mean, when I say that, doesn't that sound absolutely absurd? But it's because it is so easy, especially as the people of God, and remember prophets certainly the Hebrew prophets in the first place, they're addressing the people of God. It's so easy to begin to think that the way the world is, if it's working for us, and remember, I'm white South African, so the world was working for me. It's so easy to overlook and to ignore and to not look deeply into the present. And that's why when I do, yes, it helps me to really, I think, love the prophets, but also to see how incredibly easy it is to ignore the prophets, to dismiss the prophets, to badmouth the prophets, even without being kind of a particularly bad and evil person. So I think part of that has given me, it's given me that kind of sensitivity to the whole thing.
If somebody asks you, what was a prophet, what would you say?
I like the definition that I gave in the first lecture that was based on Walter Brueggemann. And a prophet is somebody who can see deeply into the present, who can actually see what's going on, and who is also deeply embedded in God's vision for the world, and can see that huge gap, doesn't just see it as an intellectual issue, but feels it very, very, very deeply, and therefore challenges the status quo, dismantles the status quo, but also offers a vision for what life could be that's different. So prophets are preachers of an alternative possibility from the status quo, which tends to be one of oppression.
And is it really possible to be a prophet and a priest?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Can you be a prophet and a priest? I'm actually going to take that two ways. First of all, I'm going to say yes, because Jeremiah is a priest. And although, because he's of the priestly family of Anathoth, he was a priest that had been, he wasn't part of the in crowd, so we don't know how much he would have functioned as a priest, but he was a priest. And Ezekiel would have been a priest if he hadn't ended up in exile. And it's very interesting. It's probably when he's at the age that he would have taken up his priestly functions that God appears to him. So can you be a priest and a prophet? Yes. But when you see who the enemies of, or the opponents of, let me take it for an example, Jeremiah. When you see Jeremiah and you see who his opponents are, one of the groupings is the priests and the prophets. So it's interesting that a lot of prophets would have opposed Jeremiah as well. A lot of them were court prophets. They made their money by telling the kings what they wanted to hear. So you can be, but the second way I want to kind of get into that is to look at what the prophets have to say about worship. Some scholars, I think they overstated, but what they say is that that the prophets are very opposed to the temple. They're opposed to ritual. They're opposed to the form of worship, but they're not. What they're opposed to is when it becomes idolatrous. And what do I mean when it becomes idolatrous? When the rituals, the sacrifices, the worship at the temple, when all of that has become a way of keeping God in God's box and keeping God safe. And it's almost like these are the buttons you can press. So somebody actually asked me about God and about mystery and about sacraments. And because this is being recorded, I'll choose my words carefully. But I think that there is a constant temptation in the people of God. We want God to be on tap. We want God to be safe and predictable. And therefore, there is a constant temptation for our own worship to become idolatrous. In other words, we, instead of recognizing the mystery and the freedom of God, we think that we can control God. If we say this prayer, then God must do this. If we do this, then God must do that. And that's probably one of the reasons that the priests and the prophets are often at loggerheads in the Old Testament. Now, you need both. And I think it's a very dynamic conversation. So I'm just looking down here at, somebody else says, are prophets always considered part of the awkward squad? Yes, generally. If you think about it, institutional religion is important. We need the institutions, we need the structures, but they always are going to suck us into power play, being comfortable, people wanting their positions to be entrenched. And so the prophets are always going to be challenging. If you want one wonderful example of that, not from the writing prophets, but from the stories that we find in the books of Samuel, maybe you know of Nathan, who has to go and challenge King David after King David has committed adultery. Now, Nathan is a court prophet, which means that Nathan's salary is actually paid by the king. And so it's delightful to see how he's one of the less awkward ones, in that he still needs to stay in with the king. And when he challenges King David, he has to find a proverb, a parable, so that he can get his message across. I don't really have, I'm not going to talk through that, but you might just want to look. Let me find it's around 12. If you, sorry, I'm just quickly trying to find the, somewhere around 2 Samuel 15, 12, no, 13, 12, somewhere around there. You'll see Nathan's interaction with David. And I'm seeing even some more modern day prophets being mentioned here, like John Hume. I had an undergraduate student who wrote me a wonderful essay on Seamus Malin as a modern day prophet. Yes, very interesting. Somebody's just commented there, a priest must be a prophet. Yes, I guess a priest must be a prophet, but a priest probably needs a non-priestly prophet to keep challenging the priest, to stay a good priest. Yeah. And then, as somebody else has mentioned there, aren't we by our baptism, aren't we all priests, prophets, and kings? And we are. We are all called to discern where God is at work in the world, and we're all called to bear witness to that. So that's what I meant when I said that as a community, we are supposed to be a prophetic community. Interesting that Moses in, Exodus 19, when God is, just before the 10 Commandments are given, when God is speaking to Moses, he says about the people, he says they are to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. But of course, within that, there are some people whose job particularly is to be a priest. So I'd say that, yes, we are all called to be prophets. But can I suggest that maybe our calling, or the challenge for us, even more than saying, okay, let me be a prophet, let me see what I can do, is learning how to recognize and how to listen to the prophets. Because if you look at the Old Testament, I didn't actually do this in any of my videos, but you've got true prophets and you've got false prophets. And how do you tell the difference? It's easy for us because we can go to Jeremiah. So, for instance, Jeremiah chapter 28 has the prophet Jeremiah and the prophet Hananiah. Now, we have some prophets who've made their way into sacred scripture. So we have the wisdom of the tradition, which recognizes here we have, in these words, we recognize God's words to us. But what do you do when you're actually in the situation? And if you were somebody sitting in Jerusalem, for example, let me take it to the exile, because I did a bit with the exile with you. If you're sitting in Jerusalem and one prophet is telling you, don't be afraid, God is on our side, God will deliver us. Look back to the time of Isaiah, and you'll see God delivered us then. Don't be afraid, stand firm. And then the other prophet, Jeremiah, is saying, no, be very afraid and know that the exile is coming. It's not going to be short. As people in that situation, how do we work out who to listen to? And so I'd say maybe what we need to explore, not just, am I a prophet? What is my prophetic role? But maybe also, do I know how to discern in a situation what is the true prophetic voice? I mean, think now in terms of the chaos and the confusion that we live in. Think even in terms of the church, and where is the church headed, and what are the next steps? And you've got, for instance, you've got Pope Francis saying one thing, and you've got other elements in the church saying something different. I'd say that really what's called for in this moment is discernment to know how to listen for the prophets. Now, I'm wishing I hadn't said that, because I'm waiting for some of you. Oh, yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Eileen. It's 2 Samuel 12 is the account of Nathan rebuking David that I mentioned earlier. And I think when the idea of people abusing the power of their prophecy, I'd say definitely. And as soon as you do that, you become a false prophet. As soon as the prophetic role is used for self-aggrandizement, even if it's done sincerely, but it's used to promote your own agenda. I won't tell you, but you have a few accounts in the Old Testament of prophets falling down dead when they decide to say, the word of the Lord is, and it's not. And you might say, that's terribly harsh. It is very harsh. But can you imagine, in terms of the people of God, do you see how dangerous it is for somebody to be claiming prophetic authority if they don't have it? Yeah, so somebody's asking me, I'm not going there. Is Donald Trump a good example? I'm going to, of he's a really good example of somebody who needs prophets to oppose him. And I'd say there's a lot of the people of God who need prophets to give them the wisdom to actually see what's going on there. Yeah, so lots of great comments here. I'm wondering what else to to pick up on. Somebody's asked me there, can you define a priest? I guess in terms of what I was saying now, what I meant by the priest, Old Testament or New Testament, is, can I say a religious functionary? Someone whose calling is through ritual and other means. Did you hear my dog having fun outside? Someone through ritual and other means who is representing the people to God and God to the people, certainly in the Old Testament. So I'm now kind of wondering, there's lots of good questions, and now I'm a little overwhelmed. So let me.
Jessie,
Yes.
Um,
Sorry, can you hear my dogs in the background?
Indeed, yeah. Jessie,
Yes.
I'm very attracted to Walter Brueggemann's book,
Yes.
um, Prophetic Voice. Huh? What's it called?
The Prophetic Imagination.
Imagination. Yeah,
Yeah.
I found that a wonderful book. I mean, liberating. It opened the
Yeah.
prophets for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I would, if somebody wanted a book to read, I would say that would be a good book that would be a really good book. It's in its 40th anniversary edition. I know because I gave it to my students, my undergraduate students in Maynooth, that it's one of those books that when you start, it may feel like really hard work, but he keeps repeating, and you kind of, as you read through it, it's really, it's not a long book. It's really, really worth. It's really, really worth. Investing the time. I know I saw one of my students popping up here, and I hope she'll give me the thumbs up if Anne-Marie, I hope you agree with me that you'd recommend Walter Brueggemann. Can I maybe move on to questions about, a couple of you asked me about prophecy and apocalyptic, and I mentioned a third way, and then somebody else also asked me about the idea of divine agency and human agency, God's work and ours. Now, if we're thinking of how God works in the world, what you can kind of, now, as I said in the video, this is an oversimplification, but prophets tend to focus on God at work in history, God at work in the world. An apocalyptic approach tends to feel very pessimistic about the possibilities of change, and thinks that the only way that things can change is for God to step in, kind of in a sense from the outside, do away with the present evil age and bring in the age to come. Now, if you kind of say, well, how does that fit into how we live today? If your approach is the world is an absolute mess, but it's okay because heaven's coming and Jesus is coming again, and yes, we're messing up the planet, but it's okay because Jesus is coming again and that'll solve everything. That actually would be what I call a lazy apocalyptic view. If you have a very strong emphasis on how are we supposed to work to bring in justice, how are we supposed to bring about the kingdom of God? That would be sort of more kind of the idea of the prophetic. Now, as I say, that's an oversimplification, because what the prophets do is the prophets recognize that we work and God works. And you'll have found in some of the ideas that were in Kieran's in his first lecture, the idea of God and how God relates to the world. It might be that we'll find ways that we don't have to think so much either or, that actually God is at work. I don't think that the way God is at work is to say, well, okay, we'll just bring the curtain down on the world and on the cosmos, and we'll kind of recreate a new heaven. I think the continuity there is very, very important, but it can't be limited to what we do. There is the more. You might want to notice was in one of my lectures, and also in the handout, I have a quote by Walter Wink, which I really like, because it's kind of recognizing that we need to work for life and for hope and for to bring in for neighborliness and to bring in a world of justice and shalom. We need to work really, really hard at that. And to the extent that we're doing that, God also is at work alongside, with, sometimes despite us. And the question I asked about, well, how can these two link together? I think it's one of those things we've got to keep coming back to. I can't give, I can't even imagine a single answer. I think it's one of those things you live into a deeper understanding of how, to use Paul's words, work out your own salvation, plural, with fear and trembling, because it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. It's holding those two kind of things together. So that's what I was trying to kind of get you to think about a little bit. Yeah, I see there's a comment there from Anne-Marie, who's one of my students, who says, totally Walter all the way. So there's an endorsement for Walter Brueggemann's book. Somebody else has asked if the prophets were real people or given the names to relate history. I think there definitely were real prophets. The one thing that's very clear about them is it doesn't matter which prophet you read, each prophet has quite a distinctive, they're different. You can see the different prophetic personalities coming through. A wonderful exploration of the prophetic personality as found in their words is Abraham Heschel's The Prophets. So definitely. Now, what also happens is that the prophets are, the books of the prophets go through a number of different editions. So we can't necessarily say that every single prophecy that we find in the book of Isaiah dates back to Isaiah of Jerusalem. In fact, we're fairly sure that the second half dates to a later prophet. But still, the core of it is a genuine human being. And I find it very hard to imagine the prophets as literary constructs. We have all of this, we have this wonderful literature that they've given us, but there is a very profound sense of an experience of God, an engagement with the contemporary situation that really comes through. So I would say that the prophets are people. It's interesting. Some people have suggested, like if you look at the book of Revelation, sometimes you might say some of the visions are like a mosaic of various images and prophecies from the Old Testament. So if somebody told me that the book of Revelation was a literary product, so in other words, not necessarily all based on kind of live visions. Maybe. I don't think so, but maybe. But when it comes to the prophets, no. There's too much experience of life and of God happening there. Now, I wonder which texts, maybe I'll say, just so that, because this might link in with some of what Kieran did, the Loretta sisters there. I have a question about if I can say something about the image used from garden to city. I was just really, really struck that when you look at our canonical scriptures, the Christian canonical scripture begins with the garden and ends with the New Jerusalem. And it just, when you think of city, I guess you're thinking of the development of human culture, more complex forms of community. And so to trace the beginning and end using the image from garden to city, as I say, was suggested by the canonical shape of our Old and New Testament. But I think it really seems to capture something there of the fact that it's not that in the beginning everything was perfect, and then we messed it up, and God wants to restore everything to the way it was at the beginning. The movement from garden to city captures the fact that there is development, there is growth. As human beings, I think it's part of God's intention that the way we live, our communities become much more complex, which is what happens in city. But of course, if that's the road that the cosmos is taking, two things. First of all, you can see why there is so much suffering and so much birth pangs, so much difficulty in labor, because it's creating something beautiful out of something very difficult. So much easier to be a saint if you are a hermit on your own, but to live in community makes it a little bit more complicated. In terms of a global community, you can see how much more complicated that comes. So God's vision for the world in terms of creating shalom, it's easy to have shalom, and shalom meaning wholeness, well-being, peace. It's easy to have that in a garden. To have that in a city, you really see the complexity of the project of God and God's creation. And the second thing to say alongside that is just how important the idea of covenant is for the prophetic image of God. And covenant is all about solidarity. Covenant is about God entering into relationship with God's people and God's people being in a relationship with God. It's not a comfortable God being just a king. It's a journeying together. And I have tried in my inputs to stress that the covenant partner has agency, meaning that God doesn't deal with us as puppets, and that God doesn't deal with the cosmos as a puppet. And it really is a co-creation. It's us and the cosmos and God together. And I think that's picked up in the idea of covenant.
Jessie.
Yes.
I see one of the questions coming in is, how are the prophets viewed in modern Jewish spirituality? And my overall impression, looking at the Jewish prayer book and our practice of liturgy, is that we give far more space to the prophets than you'd find in the regular Jewish prayer book.
That's interesting. Now, you'd have to speak to that. I wouldn't know it in terms of regular sort of regular Jewish prayer practice. I would say what I find when I read Jewish writers on the prophets, which is very different from saying what the importance that they have in regular Jewish practice. But what I find is Jewish thinkers tend to have a freedom. I don't know. I find are really good at unpacking the prophets. Okay. Partly because there is this idea of dialogue, and Judaism is wonderful at arguing with God. Oh, yes. And that piece is in the prophets, and the Jewish thinkers that I read connect with that very well. But I'd have to, in terms of regular Jewish practice, I'm not sure. Do you want to say, Kieran, something on that?
I've been reading John Barton's book, A History of the Bible, the book and its faith. It's a terrific overview of the whole Bible. And in the course of which he says that Christians give far more attention traditionally to the prophets, in their worship and prayer than Jewish people do in the synagogue. And that's partly because the prophets were for them, and they weren't telling anything about the coming Messiah, whereas the Christian reading of the prophets has been, this is about Jesus. And so even in our liturgy, for instance, on Sundays, the vast majority of the first readings are from the prophets. Mostly, and the star is Isaiah. We hardly ever hear from, on Sunday readings, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, Chronicles, Nehemiah. We hardly ever hear. The voice is always a prophetic voice, which in some way foreshadows something about Christ, which in some ways is it's a very Christian interpretation. Probably doesn't do justice to the historical context of the individual prophets. I think it's interesting that the Jewish prayer practice reads them less than we do. And they also read the Psalms less. I mean, the Jewish prayer book is not made up of Psalms. It's not the breviary.
Interesting. Now, it's interesting that what you've said there about how Christians read it. And that's a little bit what I mean about in terms of the power of the reading. I find that absolutely, if we read the prophets and we see in them Christ, but then we have to have more of that understanding of the cosmic Christ. Christ has to be big enough. Yeah. Because otherwise what happens is they simply become, oh, this was foretold and then Christ did it. Yeah. And it's yes, but as the people of God, how are we also called and how are we also challenged? And that's why I think, now again, huge brush strokes, I'm being very unfair, but there tends to be a domesticating of the prophets in the Christian tradition.
Wow.
That would be my sense. Yeah. Okay. As indeed there tends to be a domesticating of the cross and of crucifixion and resurrection. You know, it's wonderful. Jesus did it for us, which means we don't have to live cruciform lives, which is nonsense. We do. Yeah. I see a few questions, like for instance, somebody asking the difference between a prophet and a clairvoyant, and somebody else asking about COVID-19. Maybe just to say, using our present situation, what it is that, to go back again to what it is that prophets do. Now, what I would like a prophet to do would be to tell me, do I have to go to all the effort of putting all my stuff for next semester online, or will it be fine? Will I just have classes again? Do you know what I'm saying? I want someone who's clairvoyant in that sense. I want somebody to tell me what the world will look like in 6 months or a year's time. Now, that's not what a prophet does. What the prophets that we need now will help us to make sense of COVID-19 and this whole crisis, not as oh, here is an explanation for it. Not sense as in give me the way to, this is what God is doing, you know, but help me to actually really look down and to see the issues. Do you know who I find prophetic in that at the moment, interestingly, is Dr. Tedros. Sorry, I can't say his surname. Doctor of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, and Dr. Mike Ryan, Irish guy who, if you listen as I do to the World Health Organization broadcasts, what they keep on saying about the COVID crisis, they say no one is safe until we are all safe. National unity, global solidarity. Now, that's what prophets do. Prophets look at the situation and recognize in all the difficulty and all the mess around COVID-19, what has become very, very clear is the invitation from God, once again, to focus on the most vulnerable and to recognize that if the most vulnerable are not safe, then nobody is safe. And those dynamics are shown very strongly in this COVID crisis. So that is that's the kind of thing that a prophet will do. A prophet will help us when we hear so many different voices about, do we open up or don't we open up? What the prophet helps us to discern is that the voice of the status quo, which benefits the few, that wants to go back to the way things were, or is that listening to the invitation to the new thing that God might be offering us? So I'm not a prophet. What I'm trying to do is develop the ability to hear and recognize prophets. Yeah. But that's what we desperately need. And because everybody's shouting all kinds of things, and to know who to listen to.
Walter Brueggemann has contributed 3 reflections on the COVID crisis from his point of view. And there's a link to his stuff on my webpage. I have a page on my website devoted to COVID-19, and he has very interesting reflections on it.
Okay.
He's not young now, but he's still able to talk clearly.
Yes, absolutely. I wonder, I've read something that he wrote on Psalm 77, but I'm plagiarizing him for a talk I'm doing on Friday, so I'm not going to say anything about that. Now, I'm looking at, there are other things that people wanted about punishment, God punishing, about the suffering of the innocent. So the kind of thing that I can't give a short answer to, but maybe if I can just give you a couple of things to keep in mind while you wrestle with these very, very difficult questions. One is that when you read about God saying that let's say through Jeremiah, that God is going to destroy the temple and bring about all of this destruction. And as somebody asked me a question, when God even says, I take delight in destroying, you've got to keep the context in mind. You've got to say, who is God? Who is the prophet speaking to? When the prophet preaches destruction like that, the prophet is speaking to those who are in power. And the fact that they are in power in this particular system means they are upholding a very, very oppressive and a very, very unjust system. And so if God is going to be the God of the Exodus and also the God of Mary, as we see in the Magnificat, and going to give freedom and going to feed the hungry, then there are people who are going to have to be basically brought down from their thrones. So we need to recognize when we think of is like with the covenant, if God is punishing, that shouldn't God just forgive? Well, if God just forgives and overlooks that kind of an unjust structure, what in effect God is doing is ignoring the cries of the poor and of the oppressed. Now, again, this is not something that's going to solve everything, but these are just some of the kinds of things that we need to think about. And we need to also recognize the interconnectedness of everybody. And also that prophets are poets, that prophets speak rhetoric, that prophets are about breaking through people's complacency. And let me maybe bring it to a modern situation. Let's think of the many crises that the church has been through, particularly the abuse crises. Of course, we would like to hear if we, let me rephrase that. In terms of the abuse crisis, if we say God is a loving and a forgiving God, I think that people who perpetrated and facilitated abuse need to have a prophet help them to encounter the rage and the anger of God. Not because God ultimately hates them, but because the love of God as it works into, for instance, a situation of abuse, has to break through people's complacency, people's self-deception, people's lies, people say, oh, sure, this will be fine, or whatever. Do you know what I mean? We can see in terms of so much destruction, and even so much of the difficulty that the church has entered into. I think as to see the anger of God, and to see God standing against covenant breaking, I think that needs to be part of our narrative. I really think we can't, on that kind of thing, we don't need to have a tame God.
Jessie, I see it's 3 minutes to 8 o'clock. Did you want to say something closing, or shall I bring it to an end?
Well, maybe you can bring it to an end, but maybe just a last sentence to say that when we're engaging the prophets, to just remember that prophets are involving us in a dialogue. I don't go to the prophet to find ideas that will give you, this idea which will somehow explain COVID-19, or this idea which will somehow explain something. Prophets aren't there to give people ideas to take away, but they're trying to draw us into a transformative dialogue. So I try to give you some of the interesting ideas that you find in the prophets, but I hope that even more than that, I'm helping you to see how prophets are to be engaged with. And it's precisely where they're difficult that they draw us in. So I do hope that you experience the prophets somehow like that.
Jessie, thanks a million. That's wonderful. As you pointed out, we have writing prophets who are men, of course, and there were also women prophets who don't seem to have written. And as you
and don't forget, maybe also in the latter part of Isaiah.
Yes, yes, but Paul also talks about birth pangs.
Yes. No, but he does it from an outsider perspective.
Oh, okay. I bow. There are also prophets in the classical world, and one of the most famous of them was the Delphic oracle in Delphi in Greece. When the Christians finally closed down the Delphic oracle, her last words were supposedly, "There was so much left to say." So that's where we have to end this evening's very fascinating night on the prophets. As always, there's so much left to say. So big thank you to Ian and Eilish for holding the technology together. Big thank you to Jessie for holding that long conversation with invisible conversation partners for more or less an hour. And tomorrow night, we continue looking at Colossians and Ephesians at 7 p.m. and look forward to seeing you all there. Good night, everybody, and God bless.
Thank you.